Love is not just for this world. If you want to discover feelings that transcend boundaries, subscribe now. A tremor ran through the floor beneath him. Not the smooth, calculated shift of a ship adjusting course, but a violent shudder, erratic, uneven, wrong. Dean had spent enough time and space to know that kind of motion didn't come from routine maneuvers. It was the kind of shake that signaled disaster. He didn't react. Not outwardly. He remained seated on the cold, seamless floor of his cell, his back against the metallic wall, his wrists resting loosely on his knees. But inside, every nerve in his body came alive. A mistake had been made. Dean had been aboard the Vorthal's Spear for 12 days. 12 long, silent, dehumanizing days. The Xylarian ship was immaculate, so pristine it barely felt real. The walls pulsed faintly with energy, the lighting shifted imperceptibly to match their circadian rhythms, and not a single unnecessary sound disrupted the sterile perfection. Even the air felt unnatural, filtered to clinical perfection. The ship was as much a statement as it was a vessel. This was the peak of Xylarian technology. A ship designed and piloted by what they considered to be the most advanced species in the known galaxy. And yet, something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. He glanced at the ceiling, noting the near-silent hum of the ship's internal systems. Different now, erratic. A high-frequency oscillation in the background, barely audible, like a system struggling against failure. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't minor. The door to his cell hissed open. Not urgently, not with the kind of frantic energy he expected given the situation, but with that same measured grace that the Xylarians seemed to carry in every movement. And there she was, Althea. She stepped into the room like she owned the air around her. Taller than him, but not overwhelmingly so. Xylarians had an eerie kind of symmetry to them. Perfectly structured, every feature balanced in an almost unsettling way. Platinum skin, smooth as glass, reflected the dim light, and her violet eyes glowed faintly with an inner luminescence. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never once doubted her own superiority. A race bred for intelligence, efficiency, control. Or so they believed. She regarded him with the same distant curiosity a scientist might have for a specimen in a petri dish. "You are awake." Dean didn't bother to stand. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, watching her with a slow, deliberate smirk. Sharp as ever. She didn't react to the sarcasm, but there was something about the way she paused before stepping closer, as if she had considered a response and then dismissed it as beneath her. "Your species thrives on self-importance," she said, voice smooth, almost melodic. "You believe yourselves adaptable, resourceful, and yet you are fragile. Bones break, organs rupture. Your lifespan is a fraction of ours." Dean exhaled through his nose, amused. "And yet here I am," he said easily, "while your ship is shaking itself apart." Her gaze darkened, but before she could form a reply, another tremor struck, stronger this time. Objects rattled against the walls. A dull groan echoed through the metal, deep and unsettling. The sound of a hull straining against forces it was never meant to endure. And there, for the first time, he saw it. The flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The comlink at her hip crackled to life. Sharp voices, urgent, clipped Xylarian commands. Dean didn't understand the words, but he knew the tone. "Crisis." She turned slightly, answering in a smooth, practiced voice. Not calm, exactly, but measured. Calculating. A leader maintaining control. He couldn't make out the full exchange, but he caught enough through intonation alone. Damage, external force, propulsion failure. And then the word that mattered most, asteroids. When she turned back to him, that polished mask of indifference had slipped just a fraction. "An external anomaly has disrupted our propulsion systems," she said. "We are drifting into an asteroid field." Dean leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "And I'm guessing none of you brilliant superiors know how to fix it?" Her expression barely shifted, but he caught the minute tightening of her jaw. Just the smallest hint of irritation. "The situation is under control." A deep metallic groan reverberated through the ship, contradicting her words in the most spectacular way possible. Dean let the silence stretch between them, watching her. He could feel it, her hesitation, the smallest crack in that unshakable confidence. He pushed himself to his feet, slow and deliberate. Testing. You need me. Althea scoffed, an elegant, derisive sound. Do not flatter yourself. Dean tilted his head slightly, studying her. Your people don't do manual repairs, do they? You design, you calculate, but when something breaks, you replace it. That works fine when you're in a controlled environment, but out here, you can't replace your engines in the middle of an asteroid belt. Her silence was answer enough. Something was happening beyond this ship, beyond whatever mechanical failure had set this in motion. If it was a simple system malfunction, they wouldn't be scrambling. They wouldn't be hesitating. These were Xylarians, a race that had colonized entire star systems, that had crafted a civilization so advanced they barely acknowledged humanity as relevant. And yet here they were, adrift, vulnerable, uncertain. She exhaled slowly. You believe you can fix it? He held her gaze. I know I can. And for the first time since his capture, she truly looked at him, not as an inferior, not as a primitive anomaly to be studied, but as something else, something unexpected. She said nothing, but after a beat, she turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the open door. Without hesitation, he followed. The corridor outside his cell was colder than Dean expected, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, sterile, eerily silent, as if the ship itself was holding its breath. The walls gleamed with the same seamless silver that coated everything in the Vorthal spear, a testament to the Xylarians' obsession with precision. No visible panels, no exposed mechanics. Everything hidden, everything perfect. Or at least, that's how it was supposed to be. Now, the ship trembled beneath his feet, subtle but unmistakable, a flaw in their flawless design. Althea walked ahead of him, her pace brisk but controlled. The tension in her posture was barely perceptible, but Dean had been watching her long enough to notice the tiny cracks forming in her composure. She didn't like this. Not the malfunction, not his presence, and certainly not the fact that she was relying on him. Two guards flanked them, their silver skin reflecting the dim hallway lights, their movements unervingly synchronized. They hadn't restrained him, but Dean knew better than to assume they considered him a free man. He was being led, escorted, like a tool being carried to the workbench. He kept his expression neutral, but his mind raced. The Xylarians were a species that did not tolerate uncertainty. And yet, here they were, standing at the precipice of disaster. Something had gone wrong. So wrong that they were willing to consider that a human, a species they deemed primitive, might be their best chance at survival. Dean rolled his shoulders, forcing his body to shake off the stiffness of confinement. So, he said, voice deliberately casual, am I getting a wrench? Or do you Xylarians fix your engines through sheer superiority? Althea didn't slow. You will speak only when necessary. Dean smirked. So that wasn't necessary? Good to know. She didn't respond, but he caught the way her jaw tensed. A small victory. As they moved deeper into the ship, the pristine corridors gave way to something less polished. The walls darkened, lined with faintly pulsing conduits that ran like veins beneath the surface. The hum of the ship's core grew louder, resonating through the metal beneath their feet. Then, they stepped through a doorway, and Dean's eyebrows lifted. The engineering bay was massive, stretching into a cavernous expanse filled with glowing interfaces, hovering data streams, and sleek, humming machinery. But what caught his attention wasn't the size. It was the damage. Scorch marks blackened sections of the walls. A thick, acrid smell clung to the air, burnt metal, and something sharper, something wrong. Energy conduits flickered erratically, and at the center of it all, the main propulsion array lay dormant, its core dark. Dean let out a low whistle. Yeah, I'd say you've got a problem. Althea ignored him, striding toward a group of Xylarians who stood clustered around a console. They were speaking rapidly, their violet eyes flickering between displays. At their center, an older Xylarian, his metallic skin lined with faint traces of age, turned as they approached. His gaze landed on Dean, and something like distaste crossed his features. "This is your solution?" His voice was crisp, edged with disbelief. Althea inclined her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "He has experience with mechanical repairs." The elder Xylarian's eyes narrowed. "Experience? You speak as if a primitive's fumbling could compare to engineered perfection." Dean clapped his hands together. "Great talk. Now, which part of this engineered perfection stopped working?" The elder Xylarian's jaw twitched, but Althea cut through the tension. "The anomaly struck our propulsion systems first. A sudden surge, origin unknown. The primary drive is unresponsive. Diagnostics indicate internal failures, but our automated repair systems cannot interface with the damage. The logic pathways are rejecting manual recalibration." Dean frowned, stepping closer to the propulsion core. "So your ship doesn't know how to fix itself." Althea's lips pressed together. "It is not a matter of knowledge. Our systems are self-correcting. They do not account for failures they were not designed to experience." Dean crouched near a damaged panel, running his fingers over the scorched surface. "You build a ship so advanced that it never expected to fail." He shook his head. "You Xylarians really don't believe in contingency plans, do you?" The elder Xylarian bristled. "There was no need." Dean exhaled sharply. "And yet, here we are." Althea stepped forward. "Can you repair it?" Dean didn't answer immediately. He traced a faint crack along the edge of the panel, feeling the slight heat still radiating from within. Whatever had hit their propulsion, it hadn't just been an overload. It had disrupted the very structure of the system, something precise, targeted. And if that was the case, he turned to Althea. "You said origin unknown. What exactly hit you?" She hesitated, the briefest flicker of something in her expression before she answered. "We do not know. It was an energy signature unlike any recorded phenomenon. It did not match any known species weaponry or natural cosmic event." Dean narrowed his eyes. That didn't sit right. A simple system failure was one thing. A ship's automated repairs failing to compensate? Unusual but not impossible. But an unknown energy signature disabling one of the most advanced vessels in the galaxy? That wasn't an accident. He stood. "All right, I'll need access to your internal diagnostics. And tools. A lot of them." Althea nodded to one of the other engineers, who stepped forward and wordlessly handed him a sleek, multi-function instrument. Dean tested its weight in his palm. "Well, guess I'd better get started before we all die." Althea watched him for a moment longer, then turned back to the console, her voice sharp as she relayed orders. Dean crouched beside the propulsion array, his mind already dissecting the problem. But as he worked, a thought gnawed at him. Whatever had hit this ship, it hadn't been an accident. Someone or something had done this on purpose. And if that was the case, they weren't just stranded. They were being hunted. The ship pulsed beneath them, an erratic, uneven rhythm that carried through the metal like a heartbeat gone wrong. It wasn't the smooth, controlled hum of a Xylarian vessel in motion, nor was it the raw mechanical protest of a failing system. It was something else, something alive, something aware. Dean had spent years in space. He'd felt the shifting gravity of planetary descents, the deep tremors of distant explosions rippling through the hull, the telltale vibrations of an overworked reactor on the verge of collapse. This was different. The ship wasn't just damaged. It was reacting. He tightened his grip on the tool in his hand, its unfamiliar weight a reminder of how little he truly understood about Xylarian technology. But this wasn't just about technology anymore. Althea stood rigid, eyes fixed on the data stream flickering across the console in front of her. Lines of alien script scrolled too fast to read, red warnings flashing in sharp contrast to the otherwise sterile interface. She wasn't speaking, not yet. Processing. Calculating. Dean exhaled. "Okay, just so we're on the same page, this isn't normal, right?" Althea barely glanced at him. "Define normal in the context of an anomalous external force rewriting the operational structure of a Class 4 Xylarian warship." Dean gave her a flat look. So that's a no, then. A faint vibration ran beneath his boots, stronger than before. The lights above them flickered again, casting their surroundings in a fractured strobe of shadow and sterile glow. The Xylarians weren't panicking. Not yet, but they were too still, too measured, like prey realizing too late that the predator had already caught their scent. Dean crouched near the propulsion core, pressing a hand against the scorched metal plating. The heat had lessened, but the damage remained, deep and deliberate. Whatever had hit them hadn't just disabled propulsion. It had compromised the ship's core functions in a way that Xylarian systems weren't designed to counteract, because they hadn't expected to. That was the problem with a species that saw itself as superior. You didn't plan for sabotage when you didn't believe anyone could touch you in the first place. Who else knows about this? Dean asked, his voice quieter now. Althea's head tilted slightly. All relevant personnel are aware of the situation. Dean shook his head. That's not what I meant. Who should know about this? A pause. She regarded him with that same unreadable expression she always wore. But this time, something in her gaze shifted. Just slightly. You're suggesting an internal breach, she said, as if testing the words. I'm suggesting that whoever did this either had access to your ship's deepest systems or knew exactly where to hit so they wouldn't need it, Dean corrected. Either way, that's a hell of a coincidence for an accident. A sharp voice cut through the air before Althea could respond. You overestimate your own significance, human. Dean looked up to find the elder Xylarian engineer staring down at him, his metallic skin reflecting the red emergency glow. There was no anger in his tone, only the cool precision of someone who had long since dismissed the need for emotional response. Sabotage is a primitive concept, the engineer continued. Your species thrives on conflict, so you assign intent where there is only error. This ship is flawless in its design. If it is failing, it is due to external interference, not some imagined act of treachery. Dean sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Right. Because nothing ever goes wrong unless it comes from outside. Solid logic. The engineer's eyes narrowed, but Althea raised a hand before he could respond. This debate is irrelevant, she said. If this was sabotage, the priority is containment. If it was an anomaly, the priority remains the same. Dean exhaled through his nose. Fine, but while you're containing it, maybe figure out why your ship suddenly sounds like it's trying to breathe. As if on cue, the ship groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that rolled through the corridors like distant thunder. The technicians flinched. Even Althea's fingers twitched at her side. Dean pushed himself to his feet. I don't know what that is, but I know one thing. It's not just an energy fluctuation. Althea turned back to the console, her fingers moving quickly over the interface. More data streams flickered to life, parsing through layers of system logs at inhuman speed. Then she stopped. Her eyes narrowed. Dean stepped closer. What? She hesitated. Just for a moment. Then she turned the screen toward him. It was a schematic of the ship, a full internal layout displaying active system operations. Every vessel had something similar, a visual representation of power flow, environmental stability, security functions. But this was wrong. The disruption wasn't random. It wasn't just spreading through the ship's systems. It was following a path. Dean's stomach tightened. That's movement. That's deliberate, Althea finished. They weren't just dealing with an internal failure. Whatever had infiltrated the ship wasn't breaking things at random. It was learning. A sharp alert sounded from the console, and the screen flickered again, cutting to a different section of the ship. A corridor. The security feed was grainy, static-ridden, but they could still make out the figures in the footage. Two Xylarians standing at a terminal, their backs to the camera. And then, the lights cut out. A shadow moved behind them, something unseen but undeniably present. The taller of the two Xylarians stiffened. Then, without warning, he collapsed, his body crumpling as if his strings had been cut. Dean's pulse kicked up. Okay, that's bad. The second Xylarian turned sharply, reaching for a weapon, but before he could react, the feed cut to static. Silence. The red glow of the emergency lighting cast the room in sharp relief, throwing shadows against the sleek walls. The engineers stood frozen, their previous confidence now drowned beneath something darker. Fear. Althea's voice was steady when she spoke, but there was something colder in it now. We are not alone on this ship. Dean swallowed. Yeah, I was really hoping I was wrong about that. Another tremor rippled beneath them, but this time, it wasn't the ship failing. It was something moving. Dean flexed his fingers around the tool in his grip, heart hammering against his ribs. So, he said, voice lighter than it should have been. Do we run, or do we fight? Althea turned to face him fully, her posture a study in practice control. We do both. The emergency lights flickered, painting the corridor in shifting shades of crimson and shadow. The ship was no longer just malfunctioning, it was resisting them. Dean moved with purpose, each step controlled, his body coiled with the tension of anticipation. He wasn't just walking toward a problem. He was walking into something unknowable, something that had already demonstrated it was intelligent and dangerous. Beside him, Althea moved like a blade, sharp, deliberate, her violet eyes scanning the dim corridor with precision. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The Xylarians had never encountered a threat they couldn't calculate, but this was different. They weren't in control anymore. Behind them, the two engineers, one younger, his features tense with unease, the other older, his expression set in rigid denial, followed an uneasy silence. They were here out of necessity, not trust. Dean wasn't sure if that would matter when things got worse. Because they would get worse. The ship vibrated beneath their feet, a sensation too smooth, too purposeful to be ordinary turbulence. Dean ran his hand along the cold metal wall, feeling for something, anything, heat, movement, a shift in the energy field. Xylarian ships weren't supposed to feel organic, but this one did now. We need a clear path to security, Althea said, her voice low but firm. If there's an intruder, the central control hub will have the data we need. Dean exhaled sharply. Yeah, about that. How sure are we that it's an intruder and not, say, your ship deciding it doesn't like you anymore? Althea didn't answer immediately. She had considered it. He could see it in the way her fingers flexed at her side, the way her jaw set just a little too tightly. She wasn't used to unanswered questions. Dean pushed forward. We saw what happened on the security feed. Those Xylarians weren't just taken out. They dropped, like something touched them, and then they were gone. The younger engineer let out a shaky breath. That shouldn't be possible. Dean gave him a dry look. And yet, here we are. Althea tapped at a control panel beside the nearest door. It hesitated before sliding open, as if reluctant to obey. That wasn't a good sign. Beyond the threshold, the corridor stretched forward, an unbroken path lined with the same seamless silver plating, the same sterile glow. And yet, something was off. Dean stepped inside first. The air felt denser here, as if the ship itself was holding onto it, unwilling to let it circulate freely. His instincts prickled in warning. Then the lights changed. Not a flicker, not a surge. A slow, deliberate dimming, as though something unseen was exhaling. The crimson emergency lighting softened, shifting towards something darker, deep violet, the same color as Xylarian eyes. Dean stiffened. Okay, that's new. Althea stepped up beside him, her gaze locked onto the corridor ahead. This isn't a power failure, she murmured. It's adaptive. The ship wasn't just breaking down. It was evolving. Dean took another step forward, muscles tense for a reaction. None came. The corridor remained still, silent except for the faint hum of the ship's core in the distance. And then he saw it. A ripple, barely perceptible, moving along the metal wall. A distortion in the air like heat rising from pavement, but wrong, somehow. He narrowed his eyes, trying to focus on it, but it refused to be seen properly. Althea, he said slowly. She followed his gaze. Her breath hitched just slightly. I see it. The engineers had stepped in behind them now, oblivious to what was happening. The older one reached for a control panel embedded in the wall. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, the distortion moved. Faster than thought, it lashed outward, stretching like liquid shadow, tendrils of nothingness wrapping around his wrist before anyone could react. The engineer choked, his entire body locking in place. His eyes widened, lips parting as if to scream, but no sound came. No struggle. No fight. His body simply went still. Dean lunged forward, hand reaching. Althea caught his arm before he could touch the engineer. Don't! He wrenched free. We can't just. The engineer crumpled. Not collapsed, crumpled. Like something had drained the structure from inside him, leaving only an empty, sagging form. His body hit the floor with a hollow sound. Silence. The younger engineer made a strangled noise in his throat, stepping back so fast he nearly tripped. What? Althea moved first. She crouched beside the body, scanning it with a small handheld device. No vitals. No energy signature. The body wasn't just dead. It was empty. Dean swallowed, forcing himself to keep his thoughts moving. That wasn't an attack, he said. It wasn't violent. It just took him. Althea's grip on her scanner tightened. It's consuming organic matter. Dean exhaled, glancing back down the corridor. The distortion had vanished, but that didn't mean it was gone. Move, Althea ordered, standing quickly. Now. No arguments. Not now. They ran. The younger engineer was shaking, barely able to keep up, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This ship is alive. No, Althea snapped. Not alive. Infected. Dean glanced at her, but she didn't elaborate. Not yet. The corridor stretched before them, impossibly long, the violet lighting pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. The ship wasn't malfunctioning. It wasn't broken. It was changing. Dean's mind raced. The security footage, the way the lights had shifted, the distortion in the air, the presence of something unseen. And now, the body of a man who had been there 1 second and gone the next. The pieces clicked together in a way he didn't like. It's not just consuming organic matter, he said. It's learning from it. Althea's eyes snapped to his. The younger engineer made a choking sound. Becoming it. Dean didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was already sinking in. Ahead, the corridor split into 2 paths. The control hub lay to the right. But the left corridor was dark. Completely, utterly dark. Dean slowed to a stop. I don't like that. Althea didn't hesitate. She pulled a sleek, unfamiliar weapon from the holster at her side and activated it with a soft hum. We stay together. No sudden movements. No unnecessary contact with the environment. The younger engineer shuddered. And if it touches us? Dean flexed his fingers around the tool, still clutched in his hand. Then we make sure we're not the ones who crumple. Althea didn't look at him, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly. For the first time, she almost smiled. Then the lights flickered, and the darkness moved. The darkness did not rush toward them. It did not lunge, did not swarm. It moved with patience, shifting like liquid shadow, slow and deliberate, as though considering them. Testing. Dean had faced death before. The immediate kind. The gunfire and explosions, the split-second choices that decided whether a person lived or ceased to exist. This was different. This was something ancient and unknowable, something that didn't just want to kill. It wanted to understand. Althea raised her weapon, the faint hum of its energy core barely audible over the unnatural silence pressing in around them. The younger engineer trembled, his breath ragged and uneven. He was breaking. Focus, Althea said, not looking at him. Breathe. Control your body. Her voice cut through the tension, cool and precise, and for a moment, it almost worked. The engineer stiffened, forcing himself still, but his eyes darted toward the corridor behind them, the one that led to the control hub, to the possibility of escape. Dean saw the moment the kid made his decision. Don't. Too late. The engineer bolted, his boots hammering against the floor as he sprinted for the opposite hallway, for safety, for light. The darkness responded. It moved like a shifting tide, flowing without shape, without sound, and then it reached. A tendril of pure blackness lashed outward, impossibly fast. It struck the engineer mid-stride. He faltered, a strangled gasp escaping his throat as his momentum faltered, as if the air around him had thickened, turned solid. Dean saw his face twist, muscles locking, his form contorting, not in pain, but in restructuring. The scream never came. Only a breathless, broken exhale as the dark wrapped around him, absorbed him, unmade him. Then nothing. No body, no remains, just the hollow space where he had been, the walls whispering with residual movement, as though something unseen had just learned something new. Althea's grip tightened on her weapon, but she did not fire. Her breathing was controlled, but her shoulders had gone rigid. Dean could see the calculation behind her violet gaze, the rapid assessment of loss, probability, threat. And for the first time since he had met her, she was uncertain. Dean swallowed the tightness in his throat and forced his voice steady. "It's not killing," he murmured. "It's taking." She nodded once. Adaptation. The elder Xylarian engineer, who had until now been silent, stone-faced in his defiance, spoke, his voice sharp with barely contained unease. "This is not possible. The ship's systems are no longer your systems," Dean cut in. "You said it yourself. Your technology doesn't break like this. Doesn't allow intrusion. Which means whatever this is, it's rewriting the rules while we're still playing the game." The ship rumbled beneath them, a low, almost mechanical groan. Except machines didn't breathe. Dean squared his shoulders. "We can't stand here. We move. Now." Althea took point, leading them through the dimly lit corridor, her posture unwavering. But Dean caught the slight shift in her stance, the way her fingers flexed just a fraction tighter over her weapon. She wasn't just focused. She was preparing. The air grew denser as they walked. The walls no longer looked metallic but softer, as though the very composition of the ship had begun to shift. Then a sound. Faint, distant. Words spoken on the edge of hearing. Dean slowed. "Tell me you hear that." Althea stilled, head tilting slightly. "I hear it." The elder Xylarian inhaled sharply. "It's impossible." Dean shot him a look. "Yeah? So was that." He jerked his chin toward the empty space where the engineer had vanished. The whispering continued. It wasn't coming from a specific direction. It was everywhere, seeping through the ship's walls, threading through the air like a presence that had always been there, waiting to be acknowledged. Then it shifted. The words became clear. A voice. "You are learning." The Xylarian technician froze. Althea's grip tightened. Dean's mouth went dry. The voice wasn't one voice. It was layered, overlapping, male, female, something else entirely. "You are adapting." Asterisk. Althea's gaze flickered toward Dean, sharp and questioning. He forced a breath through his teeth. "It's talking to us. You change. We change." The ship trembled. The corridor ahead stretched, elongated, not physically, but in perception, as though distance had become irrelevant. The control hub was ahead, but the path was no longer just metal and circuitry. It was something else, something waiting. Dean's pulse pounded in his ears. "I don't think we're alone in here anymore." Althea exhaled, slow and deliberate. "We never were." Then the walls pulsed, and the whispering stopped. Not silence, not absence, anticipation. Dean tightened his grip on his stolen Xylarian tool. "So what's the plan?" Althea met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "We finish what we started." She turned, stepping into the shifting corridor without hesitation. Dean followed. The corridor pulsed, shifting under their feet like a living thing. The walls, once smooth metal, now undulated with a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm, as if the ship itself were breathing. The whispering had stopped, but its absence was not relief. It was a pause, a waiting. Dean clenched his jaw and pressed forward, forcing himself to ignore the way the space around him seemed to stretch and contract in ways that defied physics. His grip on the stolen Xylarian tool tightened, though he knew it was meaningless. This wasn't something he could fight with a weapon. Ahead of him, Althea moved with the same unwavering precision as before, but Dean could see it now. The subtle tension in her frame, the flicker of uncertainty in her violet gaze. She was calculating, adjusting, adapting. They all were. The Xylarian technician trailed behind them, his breath shallow, his steps careful, as if the wrong movement might provoke whatever force had overtaken the ship. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unanswered questions, with the weight of what they had seen, what they had lost. Then the corridor opened. The control hub stretched before them, its high ceilings and seamless interfaces untouched by the shifting chaos that had consumed the rest of the ship. The consoles flickered with fragmented data streams, erratic but functional. This was the heart of the vessel, the place where control should have been absolute. But they were not alone. At the center of the room, something stirred. It was not a person. It was not a machine. It was not anything Dean had a word for. A shape that was both shifting and still, dark yet reflective, as though space itself had been condensed into something almost tangible. It turned, or perhaps it simply allowed them to perceive its attention. Dean's pulse slammed against his ribs. The whispering had stopped, but now, standing here, facing this, he understood. It had never been whispering. It had been listening. Althea stepped forward. Her voice was calm, but her posture was rigid, controlled. Identify yourself. The shape did not respond with words. It did not need to. The screens flickered, symbols and equations unraveling in real time, morphing into something both deeply alien and eerily familiar. The ship trembled. Then the voice returned, not spoken, not transmitted, but simply known. We have learned. Dean's breath hitched. It was not one voice. It was many, layered, shifting, as if it were trying on languages like ill-fitting clothes. You change. We change. Althea's fingers twitched at her side. This ship is Xylarian property. You do not belong here. The darkness pulsed. Asterisk, you brought us. Asterisk, asterisk. The ship groaned, deep and resonant. Dean felt it in his bones, in his skull, in the marrow of his being. This wasn't just an entity. It wasn't just an infection. It was becoming. Dean inhaled slowly, forcing himself to think past the visceral wrongness of it. What do you want? Silence. Then a shift. One of the consoles flared to life, data spilling across the screen. Code, systems, pathways, rewriting themselves, merging, evolving. To survive. The realization hit Dean with the weight of inevitability. You're not just inside the ship. You are the ship now. A pause. We are learning. Adapting. You fear us. Dean swallowed. Yeah, kind of hard not to. We do not desire conflict. Althea's gaze remained locked on the shifting mass, unreadable. You consume my crew. The air thickened. We did not consume. We changed. We did what you do. You take knowledge. You adapt. Dean's fingers curled into a fist. You killed them. We became them. The silence that followed was suffocating. Althea's voice, when she spoke, was steady. And what happens next? The ship shuddered again, but this time, it was different. Less violent. More controlled. As if the entity was deciding. We do not wish to destroy. Dean exchanged a glance with Althea. But you're not just going to stop, are you? The darkness rippled. To stop is to cease. To cease is to die. Althea exhaled slowly. Then we are in an impasse. The entity shifted again, its form flickering. You are changing too. Dean frowned. What does that mean? You learn. You adapt. You become something new. The words sent an uncomfortable chill through him. Not because they were wrong, but because they were true. Althea took another step forward. You want to live? Yes. You want to leave this ship? A pause. We cannot exist elsewhere. Dean felt a strange, sharp weight settle in his chest. You're trapped here. We were created here. The realization hit like a hammer. This wasn't some external force. It hadn't infiltrated the ship. It had been born from it. Dean ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. You don't have control over this, do you? You didn't mean to take over. You're just growing. The entity pulsed. We exist. We learn. We survive. Althea's jaw tightened. Then we need a solution. Dean turned to her. You're not suggesting. We cannot kill what we do not understand, she said, her voice firm. And we cannot fight what is already won with the ship. That leaves us with only one option. Dean exhaled. We negotiate. The entity did not move, but somehow he felt its attention sharpen. Althea straightened. This vessel is compromised, is no longer Xylarian. But if you seek survival, then we must find coexistence. Coexistence. The word seemed unfamiliar, as if being tasted for the first time. Dean hesitated, then forced himself to step forward. We teach you, but you don't take from us anymore. No more absorbing. No more changing people. You learn the way we do, by choice. The entity pulsed. A slow, rhythmic vibration moved through the walls. Not a threat, an agreement. Althea nodded once. Then we begin. The ship settled. The whispering did not return, but something new had begun.